Luke 22. We are getting close to the end of the book of Luke. I have quite audacious goals tonight. We're going to try to do more than a chapter, so we will see. I am very aware of the time.
Nothing changes.
No, nothing. Yeah, I have 7 points. So the reason we're going to actually try and cover so much ground, though, is because I feel like this passage is best read as a narrative, as it's intended, like as this chain of events. And it seems to me that the passage intentionally breaks up into 7 different people groups. In some cases, it's an individual or it's a group of people, and their relationship to Jesus, or their expectations of Jesus, their interaction with Jesus. What basically happens, there are 4 different people in this passage that stand in judgment over Jesus. In some cases it's groups, but you have Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate, and Herod, and people, commentators, old guys like Spurgeon and people like that, and Barclay have interesting, they like to correlate that to, like, there are 4 evangelists and there are 4 people, the 4 gospels, and there are 4 people who stand in judgment. I don't know about that, but it's interesting. But we're going to look at the seven people or individuals or groups of people and their interaction with Jesus, the dynamic that's at work there. And the thing that you have to understand that's going on here, I want to reiterate this, is that this is the culmination of the lamb being inspected before the sacrifice. This is the week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus was being inspected. It was for the whole world to see if he passed the test to be the perfect Lamb of God, to take the sins of the world upon himself, in the same way that a worshiper in the Old Covenant would bring a lamb. If they had enough money for a lamb, they would bring a lamb as a sacrifice. The lamb was inspected to make sure it was without spot or blemish, that it wasn't sick, that it wasn't lame, before it would be sacrificed. You were not allowed to give God something that was impure, something that was imperfect. It had to be perfect. And in this, I have to remind you of what for me is one of the most heartwarming and beautiful truths in the New Testament, and it is this: when you approach God, you are not the one that is inspected when you approach his throne. Jesus was inspected. Jesus is the perfect lamb. And in the same way, in the Old Covenant, the worshiper bringing the lamb before the priest, the lamb was inspected, not the worshiper. And in the same way, in the New Covenant, Jesus was inspected to see if he was perfect, and he was perfect. Even Pilate, it's interesting, John Corson brings out that the 2 people, essentially his 2 greatest adversaries in the passage, both said he was innocent. And so there is this sort of inspection taking place. It's the culmination of the inspection. All week long he's been getting challenged. Scribes have been coming up to him and asking him questions, all those pithy questions, and Jesus has these incredible answers that just blow people's circuits. There's no one like him that can answer the questions the way that they do, and that can dissect the questions and show the person asking the question their own prejudices and presuppositions and the like. And so here we come to this place where Jesus is being inspected, and we're going to see him literally. We're actually not going to see all 4 of them in this narrative, because Luke doesn't give us all 4 inspections or judgments. We aren't privy. I believe it's to Annas's. I think we are privy to Caiaphas's, even though it doesn't call it Caiaphas's. It is Caiaphas's inspection. We're not privy in Luke to Annas's inspection, but we are privy to the other ones. But the thing that I want you to understand is that all 4 of these people groups that are actually having judgments over Jesus and they're rendering judgment, and then you have the mob in a form rendering judgment being a fifth group. They think they're judging Jesus, and Jesus is the one that's on trial. That's not it, guys. The tale of human history is that every single human being who's ever lived is on trial, and what you do with Jesus determines the verdict of your trial. And this has to be understood. Though Jesus is on trial and he's facing inspection as the Lamb that's going to bear the sins of the world, he has to be perfect to take the sin, to absorb the sin. He has to be perfect. And these people think that they are passing judgment on him, but their very interaction with him is going to be the keystone point when they stand before God, when they die. This is going to be the crux of the issue, that everything else in their judgment before God hinges on what they did with Jesus. And so I know that I think you all are believers in here. I don't know, this passage honestly is going to be a little more evangelistic. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to preach to the choir. It just is, because we are going to see that 5 of the groups of people are not believers, and we're going to see how they stand in judgment over Jesus, how they interact with him, and the things that they're doing, though they think they're passing judgment on him, judgment is actually being passed on them, and you have to understand that to understand this passage. So let me just reiterate as we begin that you will ultimately be judged by what you do with Jesus. So verse 63. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is the one who struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. Now the thing you got to understand here, I used to get this confused. This is not the same event where the soldiers mock him and beat him. This is a different event. This is when he is... So let me just read a commentator on this. So out of Matthew 26, 57 through 68, when false witnesses were brought before the council and the high priest demanded to know of Jesus if he was the Son of God, to this question Jesus replied, It is as you say, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest, so just so you know, just a little Old Testament fact, the Jews in the Old Testament used to, one of the ways they would refer to God without using his name, they believed his name was too sacred to even say or to write with the vowels, and so they left the vowels out when they wrote it, and they avoided saying it. They would say the power instead of saying his name. Sometimes they would say the name, like literally instead of saying his name, they would say the name. But sometimes they would say the power. So just kind of an Old Testament scholarly fact. When he says this here, I say to you, hereafter you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power. That was a way that the Jews referred to God without using his name. And coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They answered, He has said he is deserving of death. And it's after that he's mocked and beaten. And it is apparent that he's being mocked and beaten by the high priests and by their guards in this sort of mock trial. Now, we're going to look into it a little bit here in a moment, but this trial is actually illegal according to their own traditions in the Talmud. So they're going to, so they have this trial, and it's a mock trial. It's at night. It's illegal according to their own traditions. They're not allowed to try people at night. It had to start in the morning and had to finish by nightfall. And I'm just going to read you from, this is from David Guzik, a list of their rules according to trials. So, according to Jewish law, all criminal trials must begin and end in the daylight. The second trial was necessary, as we're going to see in verses 66 through 71. There's a second daytime trial. This is where people get really confused. There are two high priests. Well, one was the previous high priest, and he was the one that was wealthy and had the power. And then there is the second high priest, the one who actually is high priest at this point, but he does not have the power. So firstly, according to Jewish law, criminal trials must begin and end in the daylight. The second trial is necessary because they knew the first one, the real trial, had no legal standing. According to Jewish law, secondly, only decisions made in the official meeting place were valid. So the first trial was at Annas' house. and so wasn't valid. According to Jewish law, only decisions made in the official meeting place were valid. The first trial was held, in Caiaphas' house, so they called together the second trial in the council. Thirdly, according to Jewish law, criminal cases could not be tried during the Passover season. According to Jewish law, only an acquittal could be issued on the day of the trial. Guilty verdicts had to wait one night to allow for feelings of mercy to rise. According to Jewish law, fifthly, all evidence had to be guaranteed by two witnesses who were separately examined and could not have contact with each other. Sixthly, according to Jewish law, false witness was punishable by death. Nothing is done to the many false witnesses in Jesus' trial. Seventhly, according to Jewish law, a trial always began by bringing forth evidence for the innocence of the accused before the evidence of the guilt was offered. This was not the practice here. And eighthly, the whole procedure was designed for mercy. And even from Luke's summary account, it is clear that the Sanhedrin, when it tried Jesus, was far from keeping its own rules and regulations, according to Barclay. Firstly, though, here we find this first group of people, and their interaction is that they beat on Jesus. And there are those people even today who they just want to beat on Jesus. Not necessarily so much him standing in heaven, but they beat on his body, on the church, his body in the world. And it's gotten to the point, I know you guys know about like all of the blasphemy challenges and stuff like that, where people can literally like record themselves like making the unpardonable sin or whatever they these various people calling it. It is incredible in our day and age, the people who basically just want to spit in God's face. And so here we have now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. I can't even imagine like what it must have been like for Jesus to go through this. You guys understand, because he was blindfolded, he couldn't recoil from the blows, and so the blows would be twice as bad, and the damage done to his face and his body would be twice as bad because he couldn't see it coming. But the insults, literally, Jesus could have told every single one of them who punched him each time. He could have told them their birthday. He could have told them every single thought they had ever thought in their entire life. He could have willed them out of existence if he had wanted to. He could have, all of the things that you think about is he endured. He intentionally endured going through this. I want to make one point here before moving on. I remember a missionary coming and sharing, I think when I was in Bible college, about how they had just gone to Sarajevo to minister to these people. And you guys are probably too young to remember the really horrible stuff that happened in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Sarajevo, and in Kosovo, and how like the Christian, quote unquote Christian, they were like a weird Catholic form of Christianity, not really a real form of Christian, but the quote-unquote Christian nation was trying to decimate the smaller Muslim nation, and they literally let all of their criminals out of prison and just gave them like chainsaws and stuff, and like just it was like war crimes on steroids. And I remember it being in the news. It was during Bill Clinton's presidency. He actually bombed them and delivered the city, and it was a very interesting thing. I don't have time to go into the details. And I remember these missionaries coming and sharing with us who had just gone in after this, and they were literally trying to minister to people who have been the victims of the most incredibly atrocious war crimes you could ever even imagine. You can't, like, I'm not even going to tell you what they did. It was vile what the people did. And they shared, and they said, we're trying to minister to these people that have these just incredible stories, and what we ended up, I'm trying to think of how to say this, how they said it. In the end, what they shared with is the way they preached the gospel to these people is they shared with them that we share a suffering Messiah with you. And they went through these passages and they went through the sufferings of the Messiah. And it gave such weight to what they were sharing with the people when they shared the gospel with them, that the God that we are preaching to you and we are telling you is offering to bring you into relationship with himself. He's not some God out there who doesn't understand, who doesn't know your suffering, isn't aware of your suffering. Not only is he aware of your suffering and he cares about your suffering, he cares about it so much that 2,000 years ago he put himself into it intentionally. You have to understand that he caused this to happen. He knew this was going to happen. He knew he was going to be tortured and he was going to be brutalized by these people, and he did it because he loves a fallen world. And he did it so that when people who are broken and have been the victims of incredibly horrible atrocities go, how could God allow this? What gives God the right? Why didn't he deliver me? Well, I have to tell you, he didn't deliver his son. He didn't deliver his son. You say, well, that's not good enough. Well, let me tell you this. Well, I don't have time to unpack this point, but I will tell you that heaven is going to be the great equalizer. Heaven is going to make everything right. God is going to set everything right in heaven. And the person who has suffered incredible atrocities, I don't know what God is going to do in heaven for that person who has suffered incredibly horrible things, but gives their life to the Lord and trusts the Lord after those things or through those things, that God is going to make it right in heaven. So much so that maybe you had something really bad happen 10 or 12 years ago one day, and there's no doubt those things can stick with you, especially if you allow them to and you focus on them. But there can come a point many years after it where you can look back at it and you can go, particularly if God has done something through it, and you can actually look back at it and go, it's this many years later, it's not that big of a deal. Especially if you've given it over to the Lord and you've allowed the Lord to give you beauty for the ashes. As I like what Malcolm Muggeridge said, you actually, in his life, he talked about looking back at the situations, in his words, that were particularly desolating in his life with a certain fondness. Because it was through those things that his life gained an incredible degree of depth and meaning and significance, and it's really quite incredible. But when you go out into the world and you encounter people who have gone through horrible things, you are not offering them the Joel Osteen version of Christianity. Oh, a nice, happy, healthy, wealthy life. That's what Jesus offers. It's really not what he offers, not here in this world. I don't know where they get off getting that. I don't see it in Scripture. We offer them the suffering Messiah. The Messiah who loves them so much, he doesn't just understand their suffering. He doesn't just feel their suffering. He dove headlong into their suffering. So we have those people, firstly, who beat on Jesus. And I have to imagine it's got to be pretty incredible when these people are standing before Jesus, the person that they mocked and beat. If these people didn't repent and commit their lives to him and surrender, these people one day had to stand before him in all of his glory, and I'd imagine they had to eat their words. Verse 66 through 71, we see the second group of soldiers. The second group of people, the religious leaders. This is the second council, the daytime one, and these are the people that just want to get rid of him. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but there are a lot of people, I'm sure you are, there are a lot of people out there nowadays that just want to get rid of Jesus. I feel like maybe more than ever before, at least in my lifetime. There is an incredibly large, growing animosity towards all things Christian, anything and all things Christian. And people pretty much want to get rid of him. And I get it. They do. People were wanting to get rid of crosses on hillsides. They want to get rid of 10 Commandments from courthouses. They want to get rid of all kinds of stuff, and they're publicly wanting to get rid of him. But the way it really manifests itself is by getting rid of the church, is what we really see. But as soon as it was day, verse 66, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their councils, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will by no means believe." What he's saying there is, we've already had the real trial last night. We all know, everybody here knows that nothing I say matters. He's basically saying, you're just asking me this, but we both know that no matter what I say, you're not going to believe me, because we had the real trial last night. "And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God." And so he's repeating himself here. And basically, I want to make this point. One of the commentators that I read made an interesting point about that. He's essentially turning the situation. If they had given his statement here any thought, what he's saying is that you're sitting in judgment over me, but one day I'm going to sit in judgment over you. And this verse is the premise for how I personally view the entire passage we're considering tonight. That these people thought they were standing in judgment over him, but what he's saying to them is that one day there's going to come a day when I'm sitting on the right hand of the power of God on the clouds of heaven, and I'm going to stand in judgment over you. And they totally missed what he said here, because they were looking for something to accuse him with. Then they all said, "Are you then the Son of God?" So he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." Or, if you notice, if you have a New King James Version, you'll see that rightly is italicized. It's not in the Greek. He says here, "You say that I am," which is interesting because he's not actually confessing, but he's saying, "You say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." So you have here the group of people who simply, they want to get rid of him. And it's not without significance that it's the religious leaders that want to get rid of Jesus. It's very often the religious people that have almost no tolerance for the real Jesus. I don't know if you've ever maybe brought up the real Jesus with some of your hyper-religious, I don't want to call out one group of hyper-religious Christians. I really don't want to do that. There are plenty of groups of hyper-religious Christians that are so focused on the rules, so focused on the being good people and earning their way into heaven, that when you start talking about the real Jesus, it's pretty incredible to watch them come unglued. I've seen it happen with people, and you're just like, you call yourself a Christian, you take the name of Christ as your religion, you go to church all the time, but when you encounter the real Christ, it drives you crazy. Because your church that you go to lets you sleep with your girlfriend, lets you, as long as you come in, I'm not going to call anybody out, your church that you go to lets you live as some sort of aberrant form of sexuality, and it's okay as long as you can just call yourself a Christian and you can do whatever you want to do, and it's all good. But you start talking about the real Jesus, the Jesus who taught us what is real holiness, and those people want to get rid of him very often. Now, admittedly, we have the unreligious people nowadays who very often, more than any other time that I've been aware of, they want to get rid of Jesus as well. But it's don't be stumbled when you look out on the world, and it's very often the people who have the name of Christ who are standing out in these political arenas, maybe with placards that say the most incredible things. It's very often the religious people who can't stand Jesus, actually. The third group of people in chapter 23, verses 1 through 5, is going to be Pilate. And this is the group of people who, when they encounter Jesus, they're perfectly willing to sacrifice him to public opinion. There are lots of people in this world who they encounter Jesus. Maybe they even get a chance to talk with Jesus, as Pilate did. Dude, I've known people over the years, all my years as a youth pastor and stuff. It amazed me at times that you would have these kids who God would be working in their life, and God would be speaking to them, and they'd be hearing from him, and in some way or another they'd be kind of responding, but then inevitably, as time goes by, they have to make a decision. Surrender my life to this Jesus who's reaching out to me and has made himself real to me, give my life to him and ally myself with him, or go with popular opinion. Because it's just easy. There are so many hateful voices out in the world today, in social media and in politics and in the news, so many hateful voices that if you are a Christian, they are going to label you any number of horrible title: bigot, racist, prude, pilgrim, whatever. They are going to assault you for that position. If you don't agree with me, take a college philosophy class and ally yourself with Jesus. Stand up on the first day and tell them all you're a Christian and see what happens. Go to a secular university and take a stand for Jesus and tell me that the world is okay with it, that they're not going to scoff at you and treat you differently and think that you're stupid or backwards or bigoted, brainwashed. Pilate represents the people. Pilate had a very interesting conversation with Jesus. I think that we have, of all of these people that Jesus encountered and he interacted with, Pilate's conversation is the longest. Now, it's not recorded in Luke. The really long version of the conversation with Pilate is not recorded in Luke, so we're not going to delve into all the nuances of it, though it's a really interesting truth. But Pilate really represents the agnostic, because there's a point in his conversation with Jesus where Pilate says to Jesus, "What is truth?" They're talking about truth, and Pilate, says, "What is truth?" So he represents the agnostic, the person who says, "I just don't know. I don't know what the truth is. I don't know any of this stuff." And do you know why people do that? There's a very simple reason why people. One of the main reasons why people choose agnosticism. There are a handful of reasons, but one of the main reasons that I've noted over the years, whether they realize it consciously or subconsciously, a lot of people take the position of agnostic, and that basically just means I don't know. When you put an alpha in front of a Greek word, in most cases, it makes the Greek word mean the opposite. Gnosis is knowledge. Means no knowledge. So a person calling themselves agnostic just means that I don't know. I don't have any knowledge, and so I can't make a conclusive determination because I don't have all the information. But you know what's awfully convenient about that? Is that when you get into debates with people, if you call yourself an agnostic, it basically means to every question, every issue, you can say, I don't know. And so say an agnostic and I are kind of debating, or we're discussing issues. What happens is, because I'm a Christian, I have a really tightly defined worldview. And to put it another way, I have a really clear, tightly defined target right in the middle of my chest. And it says, I believe this, and they're all cohesive. And Christians, we've been getting it all out there for so long. You know exactly what I believe. You have the outline is perfectly shaped. It's crystal clear, and it makes it an easy target. And that's why Christians, by and large, we are an easy target. And I'm not saying that the things people shoot at us dissolve what we believe or make what we believe not true, but it's just simply that we are such an easy target because we've been pumping so much information out into the world through TV, through radio, through everything that's going on. But when you encounter an agnostic, if you liken it to shooting arrows back and forth, they have a really tightly defined, crystal clear target to shoot at, and you're shooting at a cloud. You're like, and it just goes right through the cloud, and they're like, I don't know. But I get to live however I want. And it's frustrating from a Christian standpoint because you can never lovingly get anything to stick with the person. I'm not saying win the argument. I'm just saying that those people are very hard to win over because they can just chalk everything up to, I don't know. I don't need to know. It's okay. I'm agnostic. I don't know. What is truth after all? I've noticed an increasing number of people over the years, and maybe it's just increasing as I get older. More and more people who I've watched get older are turning to an agnostic position. But one of the fundamental reasons they're doing it is because They are sacrificing what they know to be true or what they've encountered of Jesus that is at the very least troubling to public opinion. You guys remember, Pilate was really troubled by Jesus, and this is a little surprising because as I was reading in commentators, there are a handful of early Jewish writers, non-biblical writers, but people who just kind of Jewish historians from that time period who said Pilate was like a brutal, horrible person. And I think sometimes because what we see of him in Scripture doesn't appear that bad, because he almost appears benevolent towards Jesus, that we can think that that was his natural personality. It apparently wasn't, because a lot of people we have a good number of writings, and all of these people say Pilate was really brutal and mean-spirited and rapacious and just a bad dude. And the commentators were making a point that the Jewish leaders actually were, when they brought Jesus to Pilate, were expecting this to be a quick thing. I don't think they expected Pilate to give him such a hard time about it, because they're like, dude, the guy's brutal. He's merciless. He was known as being merciless. And they're like, he's not going to have a problem with this. But you have to understand part of the backstory that Pilate's wife had a dream about Jesus the night before. And so there's this kind of foreboding thing going on with Pilate in this situation. And he is uncharacteristically merciful because Pilate is aware that there is way more going on here than meets the eye. At the very outset of this, his wife comes to him and says, I had a dream about this man. You should basically have nothing to do with him. And then Pilate starts talking with him. And you have to know that Pilate knew, at least had heard about what was going on, that this guy had raised people from the dead. It's very unlikely that he was completely unaware of who Jesus was. Very, very unlikely that he was completely unaware of who he was. And so there's some serious foreboding going on here with Pilate, where Pilate knows that there's more going on here than meets the eye. He also interacts with the Jewish Sanhedrin on a regular basis, their political body. He interacts with them. He knows their tricks. I'm sure a lot of the commentators made points about the fact that it's very unlikely that Pilate was not very, very, very aware that this was a trumped-up charge and that there was nothing really to it, and they were just, the Sanhedrin was being ridiculous. So, chapter 23. Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And when they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, obviously lies, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Then Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered and said, it is as you say. So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no fault in this man. But they were the more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. And we're going to move on looking at Herod, and we'll come back to Pilate, because Pilate, when he hears that he was from Galilee, goes, oh, Galilee is Herod's jurisdiction. Herod just happens to be in Jerusalem right now. I'm going to send him to Herod. And part of this was like a political favor. As becomes clear in verse 12, Herod and Pilate had gotten in some sort of an argument, and there was enmity between the two of them. They were both egomaniacs. They were both merciless. And they, as is often the case with those types of people, they rub each other the wrong way. And so there was enmity between them. And so it's believed that he did this partly. He was trying to kill two birds with one stone. He was trying to get away from having to pass the judgment on Jesus. But he was also going, Herod's in town. It's Herod's jurisdiction. Herod will probably perceive this as me showing him respect by doing this instead of trying to take it to myself. And so he's like, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him. Now this is Herod Antipas, not the Herod that killed all the babies. That was his dad. Herod Antipas, this is the same guy that killed John the Baptist. Didn't just outright kill him. If you remember the story with that he was actually intrigued by John, and that he thought there was more going on with John, and he was reticent to kill him, but the whole thing with the wife and the daughter. So this is Herod Antipas, the one who killed John the Baptist, not his dad, the Herod who killed all of the babies when Jesus was born. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. This verse could be said of many seekers throughout the history of the world who have sought Jesus. They've desired to see him. They've heard there's something to him. They've heard there's more than meets the eye, and they desire to see Jesus. They want to see him do a miracle in their lives. But I want to make a point here, because this is not without import. Herod is the only person that Jesus says nothing to. He says nothing to him. He doesn't respond at all. There's some heavy truths here that we need to consider, but briefly I want to make a side point. As a believer, we want to share the gospel with people. We want to reach people. We want to share the truth with people and see them give their lives to the Lord and get saved, and whether they be family members or friends or coworkers or acquaintances. And I know earlier in my Christian life, and I've talked to people, even people recently, who find it kind of unsettling when you maybe get into a situation that's sort of, the door's open to witness and you want to witness to the person, but you don't have anything to say. And you're like, the doors seem to be open. They seem to be open. They seem to be at least somewhat interested in Jesus. And God gave me nothing to say. I have learned over the years to just let it be. God does not have something to say to every single person. Really, really and truly, he does not have something to say to every single person, particularly the person who wants to be puppet master. Or as I had for this, the person who wants to treat him like Santa Claus. The person who wants him to play by their rules and do stuff for them. I really want to see Jesus because I want him to do a miracle to see if he's the real deal. I really want to see Jesus, I'm really happy to get a chance to see Jesus. We as believers, maybe you're talking to somebody and you encounter these kind of dynamics in the conversation that, whoa, this person's kind of excited that the conversation's going to Jesus. That's cool. This person's heard about Jesus. This person's interested in Jesus. Oh, cool, I can't wait. This is going to turn into a witnessing opportunity. And then the Spirit doesn't give you anything to say, and you're like, oh, I really biffed that. No. I've learned over the years, I know what it's like when God speaks to me, and I know what it's like when he doesn't speak to me. I know what his voice sounds like in my heart. And when I'm witnessing to somebody, or I'm looking for an opportunity to witness to somebody, sometimes he gives me something to say. Sometimes he doesn't give me anything to say. And I've learned to relax when he doesn't give me anything to say. And you know what? Maybe this person, God doesn't have anything to say to them right now. Maybe it's not me. Maybe I'm not supposed to be the mouthpiece. Or maybe this person's a Herod. Herod was actually a bit of a buffoon. That's not just me saying. That's basically what the commentators say. He was a bit of a fool. And Jesus had nothing to say to him. So I want to reread verse 8. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and hoped to see some miracle done by him. This so clearly and succinctly ties into those people who in some way or another seek God, pray to God, but the reason they're seeking God is because they have cancer. Or the reason they're praying to God is because they want him to do some sort of miracle, and then they'll believe when they see a miracle. And the person who comes to God and says, if I see, I'll believe, the divine response from heaven would be, believe, and then you'll see. He's not your puppet. He's not your play toy. He's not your dog. He doesn't come when you at your beck and call. He will not respond to that sort of reaching out from humanity. He is God, and if you're going to approach him, you're going to approach him in the correct framework. Verse 9, then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him with a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. This is the point when they put the crown of thorns on him, and they beat it into his head with a reed. Then Herod with his men of war treated him with contempt, mocked him, and arrayed him with a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. And it's interesting, you see people who would normally be at enmity with each other in our political realm and in our world today in America, who would normally not associate with each other, but they find friendship in their hatred for Christianity and for everything that Jesus wants us to stand for. Verse 13, we're going to see the mob. And the mark of the mob is that these are the people that turn on Jesus when he doesn't fulfill their desires and their dreams. It's very likely that this is not the exact same group of people that was yelling, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, 4 or 5 days before this. But it's very likely that some part of this people group is the same people that 4 or 5 days before this were saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. You guys know, those people who said that on Palm Sunday, they said it because they thought he was going to be another Moses. They thought he was going to be a military Messiah. They expected him to deliver them from Rome. And when it became overtly clear that that was not going to happen, the mob turned on him. And this represents the individuals and the people throughout history, throughout time, even now, who they proclaim Jesus as Messiah. Maybe even they proclaim him as Messiah over their own life. But it's as long as things are good, as long as things are better. I think about I don't know if I quoted this with you guys. I apologize if I did, but like at the end of Madagascar 2, when they're marrying the penguin with the like bobblehead doll, and they're like, for better or for worse, and the penguin's like, for better, please. And that's like how a lot of people approach the Lord. They call him Messiah, they proclaim him as Messiah, they call themselves Christians, they go to church, but they do it because they want something out of him. They want something from him. And the Christian life they live, they don't live because they love God. They live because they love themselves. I encountered that when growing up in church and going in youth group and then being a youth pastor. I encountered it all the time. I encountered kids. Let me use myself as an example. When I was not a Christian in my junior high and my early high school years, I didn't drink. I wasn't one of the kids that drank a lot. I could have. My friends did. I got invited to the parties, but it wasn't me. And I thought about it as later on, because I was like, why was I never into getting drunk and alcohol? And I realized that I'm not like OCD, but I do like to be in control of my life. I don't like being out of control. And for me, alcohol just never had the appeal, because like I'd have a friend. He hung out in the redneck group. I hung out in the skater group largely, and at least in junior high. We had grown up together. We had played t-ball and baseball together, and we were good friends over the years. We used to bet on football games. We used to bet on the FSU UF game, and every year, and we were good friends. He was a redneck, but he would go drinking every Friday night with all his buddies out in the groves or whatever, and he'd come in Monday morning. He's like, Chris, dude, I don't even know how I got home on Friday night. I was so trashed. And I'm like, dude, that's insane. I'm like, you're not going to know that you ran some kid over on the way home on Friday night until the cops show up at your door tomorrow. I'm like, that had no appeal to me. That was me as a non-believer saying that. And the reason I say that to you is because there are certain elements of the Christian life that, because God designed life and then he told us how to live life just works better if you do it God's way. You guys, at least in some form or another, you could acknowledge that. If you don't get drunk, you don't drive drunk, you don't get a DUI, which will potentially keep you from getting a high-earning job. I remember a young girl got a DUI and all this stuff, and dude, it was got in an accident, and she hurt somebody in the other car, and I remember, like, the year after it, she came and she talked to me, and she was like, yeah, but you know what? My life's looking up. I just applied at this company and this company and this company and this stuff and this and this and this and this. And one of the companies she applied to was the company that I worked for. It was a Fortune 10 company at the time that I worked for. One of the top 10 companies in the world, fortune-wise. And I just remember her telling me that, and I went, you're not even going to get an interview. I didn't say this to her, but in my mind, I'm like, you're not even going to get an interview. you're not even going to get an interview because this company doesn't hire people with DUIs. They just don't. That's a serious criminal charge. And the company I work for, they're not even going to give you an interview. And she was so hopeful about this stuff. And the reason I say that to you is because my thought process, even as a non-Christian, was I'm not going to live that life. And so much of Christianity, if you live in moderation, yeah, you can drink, but you don't get drunk. You don't have all of these consequences and things that come about. If you don't have sex outside of marriage, you don't get pregnant outside of marriage. Teen girls who get pregnant out of marriage live below, the average teen girl that gets pregnant outside of marriage lives below the poverty line for 15 years. Guaranteed that girl's going to live below the poverty line for 15 years. Unless she happens to meet Prince Charming and he's a millionaire. That girl is going to live below the poverty line for 15 years. You don't sleep outside. You don't have sex outside of marriage. You don't get STDs. You don't torch your future life. The Christian life just works better because the God who designed life told us how to live it. But here's the deal, and this is what I'm getting at. All that was to say this, is that the churches, Christianity is, I hate to say it, is filled with people who think they love God and they say they love God, but they don't. They only love themselves. And they're living the Christian life because it's the smart, controlled thing to do. People like me who don't like to be out of control and like to have a measure of security in their life, dude, the Christian life looks really, really appealing to that person. Most of the Christians I know who've been walking with the Lord for a long time, unless there are extenuating circumstances, God just blesses them. They live life right. You know, they try to get out of debt. They don't sleep around. They don't flirt around. So they have happy marriages. Because they have happy marriages, the men, it's a statistically overwhelmingly proven fact that men who are married do way better in business than single men, particularly men that are happily married. Why? Simply because their wives are textbooks on communication. And being a happily married man, they learn how to communicate better than the single man. And so this, dude, I'm just telling you, the Christian life is the best way to live life because the God who designed the world designed the Christian life and told us how to live life. And the point is this, there are a lot of people who live the Christian life not because they actually love God, but because they love themselves. And in their opinion, the Christian life is the best life to live. But here's the problem. God's not into that. He's not into that at all. It is exactly like if every single one of you in here could imagine that person, if you have someone that you're in love with right now, them telling you that they love you for 10 years or 20 years or 25 years, and is often the case in this day and age, as soon as all the kids leave the house and they go off to high school, 20 years into marriage, them going, I don't actually love you. I don't think I ever actually did. You know what they actually did? They loved themselves. And maybe they made some bad decisions earlier in life and they ended up with you, but they loved themselves. That's how heinous self-love is. God will not tolerate it. Self-love, the extreme of self-love, you see the beginning of self-love in Cain and Abel, right? You see the beginning of self-love, and it doesn't look really heinous when Cain rises before Abel and says, hey, I want to bring God an offering. And he brings God an offering, but he brings God an offering on his own terms, not with blood, out of his own effort, not in the prescribed manner, not in faith. And God is not okay with his offering. He doesn't want his offering. And Abel brings an offering of an animal sacrifice, and we can look at that and say, man, why is God so uptight about that? Why did he make... Dude, Cain spent more time on his offering. His offering came from harder work. Cain thought of it first. Isn't it kind of prudish of God, unloving of God to be so unaccepting of Cain's offering? What's a little bit of self-love? It's not that big of a deal, right? Turn the page in your Bible. What happens next? What happens to self-love fully grown? You find that same self-loving person murdering his brother on the next page. You see, self-love in its minor manifestations or its hidden manifestations or its manifestations dressed up in a veil, a thin veneer of Christianity, why would God make such a big deal of it? Why would he not accept it? It seems so reasonable. It's not that big of a deal. At least they're living the Christian life. At least that person who doesn't love you is living in the house with you. At least they're paying the bills. At least they go out to eat with you. Sure, they don't love you. They love themselves. And because they don't love you, there are other things in their life that they love more, maybe other people. But at least they're still living in the house with you. Isn't that cool? Actually, that kind of adds insult to injury, honestly. That makes it worse. I really want this to sink in. I guess I'm just going to have to give there. I don't know if I'm doing it justice, this truth that God hates self-love. He hates it so much. Because it's like spitting in his face, but not only is it like spitting in his face, it's ultimately harmful to the person who just loves themselves, but they will inevitably destroy the people around them too. We see this mob here, and they love themselves. They turn on him. At least some of them, they turn on him because they thought he was there to fulfill their dreams and make their lives better. And when they found out that he wasn't there to make their lives better, they turned on him and they wanted to crucify him. So it is with self-love. Then Pilate, when he called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast." Then they all cried out at once, saying, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in this city, and for murder." Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them, but they shouted, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And here we see Pilate sacrificing him to popular opinion. And so it is with people who fear God. Interesting, it says here in John 19, verse 8, in Pilate's conversation with Jesus, John 19:8, it says he was all the more afraid because of a statement that Jesus said to him. He was afraid. So often the case with so-called powerful people, they're actually riddled with fear, and I tell you, don't envy them. The powerful person, the rich person, you know what comes with power and wealth? 1 Timothy 6 says, "Those who desire to be rich pierce themselves through with many sorrows." I think of Stalin, one of the most powerful people who ever lived. He lived as powerfully and as regally as any king ever did, but the dude was riddled with fear. He butchered tens of millions of people in Russia, butchered them. Extremely powerful, and the dude lived in constant fear. I saw an interesting, I don't know if it was Discovery Channel or a show about Stalin's house. He had a house out in the country, and the walls were 4 feet thick of concrete. The walls were because he was terrified of it being bombed. You can read about, he had like all kinds of neurosis. Anytime he went anywhere, he had multiple carriages or cars going, and he had all kinds of people tasting his tea. The dude lived in constant fear of being assassinated. The person who is wealthy, I remember reading this article where this guy, he was an automobile journalist, and he got to be one of the first people to test drive the new Lamborghini Gallardo. I can't think of what it's called when the middle of the top, like a Targa, the top removes, and they flew him to Miami, and he got in the car, and he's so excited about it, and then he started driving around, and he's like, but you know what? He's like, within 10 minutes of driving around, I stopped enjoying the car, and I started being afraid that I was going to get carjacked at one of the street corners, like that I kept having to stop at these stoplights. And it was interesting to me because I was like, this guy, he ended up writing an article about how his whole test drive of this dream car that he looked forward to driving for so long got soured by the fact that he was living in constant fear of being carjacked. Because there are a lot of people in this world who will kill you for a car that they can put in a shipping container and sell to somebody for $200,000 overseas. I mean, the world we live in is a crazy place. And I just want to make this point that if you're observant, you'll notice that most powerful people actually live in fear. They live in constant fear. Most wealthy people are very afraid of what's going to happen if someone's going to get their riches or their wealth. And he was all the more afraid. Pilate, even though he was one of the most powerful people in this city, he lived in fear of the mob. You guys probably know the history. Pilate actually had already had a couple of uprisings, apparently. And he had already been censured by Rome. And basically, he had been told by Caesar, if you have one more major uprising, you're done. Because even though Rome bludgeoned people into submission, it wasn't in their best interest to have uprisings throughout the empire. If they could keep the peace and get their taxes out of people, that was by far the most advantageous position to have. And so their governors, their kings, their these people that they set up in authority in the various regions, those people were tasked not only with getting the taxes, but also keeping the peace. And if you didn't do a good job of keeping the peace, they would get rid of you. And so Pilate lived in the fear of man. And so even though to everybody around here, he appeared to be one of the most powerful people in the city, if not the most powerful, he actually was a slave of Rome and a slave of popular opinion, even in ways that the regular common person probably wasn't even aware. But he was all the more afraid when he talked to Jesus, and he became very aware that there was more than meets the eye with Jesus, but he still sacrificed him to popular opinion. 21, but they shouted, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. Interesting, prevailed here seems to intimate that there might have been people, not everybody in the crowd was crying, "Crucify him." It's interesting. It could mean that they just prevailed with Pilate. It might mean that they prevailed over the other voices in the crowd. I'm not really sure. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one whom they requested who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Verse 26 through 43, we're going to see the criminals. Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. This is a man from Libya, North Africa. We know that he was a black man. We know that he had 2 sons, and interestingly enough, the 2 sons went on to become believers. This event apparently struck him so much. You have to first understand about him that he was a pilgrim from North Africa, and he had come to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. So he was an Old Testament believer at this point. He had made a pretty serious pilgrimage, a dangerous pilgrimage, to come here and to worship at the feast. And here he is compelled by the soldiers to carry Jesus' cross. The soldiers had the right to lay their sword on anybody in the Roman Empire, lay their sword on their shoulder, and they could compel them to carry something for a mile. And so soldiers do that here with Simon, but I don't know if he had a conversation with Jesus, probably not. At this point, most people who understand the medical stuff say that Jesus was in shock and on the verge of death already, and he was only carrying the crossbeam of the cross, but they say it weighed between 75 and 120 pounds, and from the beatings and from the scourgings, you know that the scourgings, the Romans didn't have the 40-1 thing that the Jews had. The Romans they beat you until the soldiers were tired. Could have been 120 lashes. Could have been God knows however many. And they were really good, because their job, those soldiers' job, was to beat you to the doorstep of death and then to stop. And very often the people died later, but that was their job. Their job was to inflict as much punishment as possible without killing you. That was their job. That was the purpose of the scourging, however you want to say it. But they compel Simon to carry his cross. Interesting. Maybe Simon hung around and saw the things that happened. He seems to be a sincere seeker, interested enough, believing enough to make the pilgrimage to come there. He undoubtedly heard about the veil of the temple being rent on this day and all the things that happened. It appears that he became a believer and that even his kids did, because his kids show up later in the New Testament, and it's pretty cool actually. But we don't have time to go there now. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, 'Blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and the breasts which never nursed.'" Speaking of what's coming when the Romans are going to come and crush them in 70 AD. "Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry?" There were also 2 others, criminals, led with him to be put out to death. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And they divided his garments and cast lots, which was a fulfillment of prophecy. There is no person who has ever lived like Jesus. No one. No person who intentionally went to the cross. No person who took the beatings and never struck back. He modeled love for us so perfectly that he never lashed out. He never responded with hate. He responded with love here. And here, I believe it's just incredible. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." People are spitting on him at this point and mocking him. And the people stood looking on, but even the rulers with them sneered, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God." The soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." And an inscription was also written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, "This is the King of the Jews." Verse 39. Then one of the criminals who were hanged, blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." It's important to note that just a few hours before this, both criminals were mocking him. That is so important to understand. Both criminals were mocking him. Just a few hours before this, "But the other answering rebuked him, saying, 'Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we received the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong.' Then he said to Jesus, 'Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' And Jesus said to him, 'Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise.'" Few things that are absolutely necessary to salvation, and we see them here. You have to own your own sins. You have to admit and come fully into awareness that you are a sinner. Here, this man who just a few hours before had been mocking Jesus to his face has in those 2 or 3 hours become a believer. Something about the things, the 7 things that Jesus said on the cross, something about his demeanor, something about the way he responded to the people, something about the people that followed him. Maybe he'd heard some of Jesus' story about him, the miracles that he had done, and he's actually starting to realize that, whoa, this is true. This guy is incredible. So he owns his own sin. We indeed justly. He owns his own sin and the punishment for it. It is so necessary for believers, for people who want to be believers, that you have to own your own sin and understand that you deserve the judgment of God, that you deserve judgment for your sin, and we indeed justly. Secondly, you have to take a public stand. Here he's taking a public stand with Jesus. He rebukes the other criminal, and he's doing this in front of the people down there who would have just been like, "You're just some stupid criminal up there." But he takes a public stand, aligning himself with Jesus. Secondly. Thirdly, he acknowledges Jesus' purity. He says, "This man has done nothing wrong." He sees Jesus' purity. Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You have to understand, when someone in this day and age said Lord, they said it like a slave said to a master, Lord. He is calling Jesus master here in a way that we don't even understand, because we don't have slaves and masters. So we don't even understand the significance of what he says here when he says Lord. He says, Master, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He exercises here faith, as he calls Jesus his master. These are the 4 or 5 things that basically are the absolute necessities to being born again, being saved, changing your destiny from hell to paradise. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Don't have time to go into it, but it's very significant. He said paradise and not heaven. Most of you who travel with us through the scriptures are at least probably pretty aware of what he means by that. I don't have time to go into it tonight, but it's very important that he says paradise and not heaven. But we're not going to go into that tonight. We're going to skip verses 44 through 49 because we're going to go over those next week. Probably just spend all of the next time we're together on those verses. But just going to finish here with verses 50 through 56. We see the faithful. Now behold, there was a man named Joseph, a council member, a good and just man. He had not consented to their decision indeed. He was from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, publicly taking a stand with Jesus as well, putting his very life on the line, knowing that he's probably going to lose his favored position in the council. If he has a business, he's going to probably be ostracized and black labeled as a business. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb. Please notice the use of the word it there. It's not without importance that in verse 53, speaking of the body of Jesus, it says, then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock, where no one had ever lain before. That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near, and the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandments. This is what I want to say to you as we end about the faithful, because something struck me that has never struck me before while I was reading that. It's not like Joseph of Arimathea was like Nicodemus, who came to him at night and was secretly admiring Jesus. In the council meetings, he dissented from the council's choices concerning Jesus. And so he was already taking a stand for Jesus. But here, he chooses to completely ally himself with Jesus and throw in his lot with Jesus when everything seemed lost. God has tons of fair weather friends. He has tons of people, as we already talked about earlier, who follow him because it's a good life, because he is loving, because he is the God who can bless people, and people see God's blessing in his children's lives maybe, and they're like, man, I'd like to follow that God. And he has lots of people who follow him for what they can get out of him. But I admire this about Joseph of Arimathea, that as far as we know, it's very likely that he had the mindset that all of Jesus' other followers had, and that is that they all failed to realize that he was going to rise from the dead. I personally am of the opinion that when Joseph of Arimathea did this, he was not expecting him to rise from the dead. He was throwing his lot in with Jesus in the bleakest hour, when there was no advantage to it. There was no benefit from it. It was all bad. All bad. He faced pretty much losing everything simply to put Jesus' body in his tomb. When it was at its darkest hour, when there was no up from this. There was no, for him, for them, it was the end. Everything seemed lost. And I want to encourage you guys that you have an opportunity, for those of you in this room who maybe you feel just like you are in a desolate season and all seems lost. This You need to see this season as an opportunity to stand with Jesus even when all seems lost. It's just such a beautiful thing. I believe it truly pleases God every time one of his children choose to stand with him and continue to serve him and love him even when all seems lost. It's an incredible opportunity you've been granted. Father, I thank you for this time together. I thank you for your word. I thank you for the truths that we've considered. There is no one like you, no one like your Son, no one who patiently put their face to the one who smote them and spit on them and mocked them and loved them as they were doing it and prayed for them to be forgiven for what they've done, Lord. There is no one like you. You are incredible. There's no one like you in human history. I thank you for what you've done for us, for me. I pray, Lord, that these truths, that you would give us the strength and the courage and the ability to take these truths out into the world, Lord. Speak to us, Father. If there are things you want us to do, maybe outreaches or ways to reach people, Father, Lord, we want to share you with the world around us. I ask that you would give us boldness and power, Lord, to make known the mystery of the gospel and speak boldly as we ought to speak. In Jesus' name, amen.